Here we go. I'm here with Dr. Julian Bryson. Am I saying that right?
That's right, Bryson.
Right? Bryson, I said it correctly. Same name as our wonderful administrative person in our management department. She's Gail Bryson.
Right.
And Julian, I've asked you to interview with me for my leadership class because I found that you had some very wonderful, notable talents in leadership, and your ability to be transparent, not only with your students, but with faculty and staff, is extremely impressive. And I wanted to capture that part of leadership, that you might do this instinctively, or you might do this in a more planned way, a deliberate way, but it works. You've been here how many years?
3 years.
3 years at Curry, and you've just won your second election as faculty chair. That's quite amazing with someone who's been here such a short time, with so many of our faculty members that have been here such a long time, many, many years, but obviously saw something in you, and with absolutely no opposition, you're working your second term. I am wondering, well, tell me a little bit about you, what brought you to Curry, and how you see yourself as a leader here.
Well, I started my leadership training, I think, in church, to be honest with you. There are a lot of opportunities for that there. And I think that has stayed with me, even if all of the theology hasn't. That there's a concept of the servant as leader. And I've been fortunate that in choirs, the people I've worked with who are great conductors also bought into that philosophy. That at the end of the day, it's not that the leader is the most important person. It's the people that you're leading. Those are the most important people. And I think when you keep that perspective alive, it changes how you make every decision. So in their cases, it was never about what's going to make me as a conductor more famous. It's what's going to make this choir sing better together. How can I help these people to work together in a better way? Now, the end result of that is the whole choir sounds better, which brings more recognition to the conductor. But that's always the side effect, not the primary goal. And I think when it becomes the primary goal, the choir members recognize that, and they stop working as hard, and they may even leave because they understand that it's no longer about the corporate product, it's about that person as an individual. And really, I've seen that in a lot of leadership positions where people just don't understand. They think that it's all about them, and it really isn't. Any leader who takes a position just because they want the title, that's about all they get. They get the title, but they certainly don't get the following. They don't get the buy-in. And so I've done my best to live that out, where my focus is on what gets the best product. And that may mean that I need to take a little bit of a back seat, or listen more, or delegate more.
But how did you get to faculty chair in such a short time?
You know, I think part of it is being available, and it was a position that came open, and I can't remember who it was that approached me first, but someone just said, "Have you ever thought about doing this?" And I said, "Not really, but it would probably help our department, because the music department, we're having some issues with staffing and
Sure.
class sizes, and just trying to make sure that everyone had a place to serve." And I knew this came with release time. So I said, I think I can do it, and it would be helpful to others if I were to do it. And so I said, I'll give it a try. And that no one ran against me, it may have, that's when I started wondering if I had signed up for something that more than I thought I was getting into, you know.
Well,
but I think what I've come to learn is that the position of faculty chair, there are a lot of ways you can take it, and there have been some in the past who have seen it as an opportunity to tell people what they should be doing. And I haven't personally witnessed that in my time here, but I've heard stories of former people who have done this. And I think my approach has been more to make sure that every voice is heard. At least every voice that wants to be heard can be heard. And as a result, I've actually gotten some flack from that. There are a couple of people who have come to me and said, you should be more heavy-handed in deciding this or telling people to do that. And I just had to push back and say it's not my style. And then I also encourage them to run. If you really feel that's the way it should be done, feel free to take that on and do it. But I just feel like when you take that approach, the people who agree with you are emboldened. The people who disagree with you generally don't have much voice. And for the long-term health of any organization, silencing up to 49% of your representation, that just makes no sense.
Right. So you look at it as more of a representative role of, if you will, the voice of the faculty, rather than just being, for lack of a better word, the dictator, the bottom line, the final say, in matters that have to do with faculty governance and administrative governance as well.
And I really think that applies well outside of just this situation. So you can imagine in a business setting where the buck stops here, ultimately this leader is responsible for the health of the company or the department or whatever. If that person only wants to hear people who agree with him or her, then you create a dynamic where you're literally just discounting up to almost half of the ideas in the department.
Right.
And if you really want to make sure you're making the best decision, why not listen to all of those ideas too? You might still end up deciding against them, but at least you know what you're up against.
How does that work into your, as a teacher? You're a leader with the faculty. How about with the students? A leader in the classroom?
One of the things I've found is that there's rarely a single right answer, at least not for the questions I'm interested in asking.
Okay.
If I'm asking what color is the sky, yes, there's a right answer most of the time, but then sometimes that's even not true. But that's not all that interesting of a question. When you get into questions of morality and ethics, or questions about how a particular piece of music makes us feel, or why that piece of music was the underscoring for that scene of a movie, there's not really a right answer that you can find. And so what I'm looking for is to create conversations, and if most of the class agrees, I'm going to ask the question, well, what if maybe there's another way to explain this?
Critical thinking of
yeah,
it?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And I think visual art especially provides an opportunity for this, because there are all kinds of symbols that we all recognize. There might be a painting that involves a cross or an X or a house, and we kind of have associations with all of those three things.
Right.
So you might ask the first time, what does this mean? And someone gives an answer, and then you say, well, what's another interpretation? What's another interpretation? And it's often the third or the fourth or the fifth one that's the most interesting one, because we've gone beyond the obvious and we start thinking about other possibilities.
Is it like that very much in music?
Oh, all the time. And in fact, that's what gets a lot of musicians in trouble. Music is far more abstract than visual art. So in visual art, you see a cross, you know what that means in a lot of contexts. In music, you hear a German augmented sixth chord, for example, which is not something that's in a lot of styles of music. It's in a late romantic classical style. You hear it, and it may bring to mind some experience that you had in the past, watching a movie and you heard something that felt like that. But that's not a hard and fast thing. The composer can't depend on every person having seen that particular scene from that movie and having an emotional reaction to it. So the composer has to think in much broader strokes, that this general feeling brings you to a general place. because of that, every listener has their own opinion as to what that piece means. And when we discuss it in a class setting, or even as we make that music, people may disagree on what it means. Some might say, this is the most racist thing ever because it quotes that Nazi hymn. Someone else might say, yeah, but the composer was Jewish and he might have written this as a critique of what was going on.
So different perspectives.
Absolutely.
So, right. So as a teacher, if what I gather you're saying in many different ways is that students have an input, students have an opinion, and it's all valid whether or not you agree with that opinion.
Yeah, and what I like to say is that there may be varying degrees of information.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone walks in and hears a symphony for the first time and says, well, that's crap because it doesn't sound like a rock band, okay, that's an opinion, but it might not be the most informed opinion, right? Just like someone who walks in and hears a rock band and says, that's crap because there's no strings. Well, it's the same kind of flat assumption that's not really based on a critical understanding. It's just your first reaction. And so I would say that everyone is entitled to an opinion, but there may be varying levels of opinions that are worthwhile. And going back to the business example, if you're leading a department, the same thing's true. There might be someone in their first day on the job, they could have a really great idea that they brought with them from somewhere else, but they might not. They might really not have a clue of what's going on. And it's up to the leader to hear that opinion and to give it value and consideration. But at the end of the day, it may prove to not be quite as valuable as someone else's, and that's okay. The point, though, is to listen and to hear that opinion, not to just immediately dismiss it because this is their first day on the job.
Right. So most teachers, as you know, in traditional venues, at least perceptually, from the student's perspective, is that the teacher has all the answers, is the final say, and is dictatorial in nature, because they are going to give me a grade. Now, I know what I do in my classes. I tell them, I don't give you a grade, you give me a grade based on my perception of what I think you're learning. But I'm interested in what you think. So there is a balance, of a more facilitative balance. As a leader at Curry, or maybe any other institution you may have worked for or will work for in your career, how do you see leaders changing? These are my two final questions. One, and number two, what do you think is the biggest problem in today's leadership, both in education and in the corporate world?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the internet has changed things tremendously. And one of the reasons that the sage on the stage used to be the working model is because that was the only way you could get information. Mm-hmm. But now, most of the questions we like to quiz people on, you can easily get just by a quick Google search, right? So why am I going to ask students to memorize the dates that certain composers were alive? Makes no sense. Now, it would be good for them to know that this group of composers were alive at roughly the same time, working together in the same areas, or that these composers never interacted whatsoever. That might have some bearing on how they interpret things, but the true details of that doesn't matter. It really doesn't. And I would say the same thing is true of history in general. It's good to know general concepts, but does it really matter if you're off by a couple of years?
No. It's interesting. Yeah, I, recently watching the new series, Genius, with, I think, Jeffrey Rush and a few others. I can't think of the gentleman's name that plays young Einstein. But the point is, I believe one segment of the movie was that Einstein was asked to memorize trigonometry functions. And he said, but sir, to his teacher, quote unquote, this is absurd. He said, what good does it do me just to memorize all these things when there are so many things that we haven't challenged? And the teacher said, enough. And he kept going. And he said, leave. Do we still have that permeating in our classrooms today?
Oh, absolutely. And I won't name names, but I do know of departments that their whole function is to prepare students for certain tests that will ask them those kinds of questions. Now, in the real world, there are some careers where that's necessary. You know, if a patient walks into the doctor and asks a question, the doctor's got to know quite a few things right off the top of the head. But then again, with the internet, perhaps the doctor could have access to a database, and instead of memorizing 1,000 symptoms and trying to match them up, you put them into a database and it pops up 5 answers, and the doctor uses his or her intuition based on experience to figure out which one is the best possibility.
And to your point, then that doesn't make the doctor any less of an expert.
No, it's asking the doctor to think differently about the information. And I think this is, I mean, that's just one example. The same thing could be true in music, where it's helpful to have a general knowledge of history, but what's more important is that you understand the stylistic considerations of each of those styles of music, right? You know what jazz sounds like, you know what Baroque music sounds like, you know what gospel music sounds like.
And rap.
But it's not that you necessarily know every person who ever performed those styles in chronological order. That's not the important thing.
But I know I can differentiate between
Sure.
the different things, and that's what's
Sure.
important here.
And
right?
if we spend all of our time forcing students to memorize lists and dates, then we've missed the opportunity for them to really learn what music is about. And it's hard, though, because we like to teach the way we were taught. And I know how I learned music history was, again, a lot about learning dates and times and places. And I know how I learned music theory was all the terminology. And so that's tricky for me to reimagine. How do I teach this to students without falling back on what's easy?
Absolutely.
So I think the same is true of leaders, though. We've all been under the influence of good and bad leaders. We recognize good leadership when we see it.
Well, that was my second question. And we can wrap this up shortly, but
Sure.
My second question was, where do you see leadership going today? Like, what is the biggest problem?
You know, I really think it's if we're lucky, I should say, I think it's headed in a flatter direction, where rather than having one person who has final say over everything, you have more people who have input into those decisions.
Right.
And in our earlier conversations, I mentioned I'm a part of a group called Triad, which is a
Yes.
collective.
Yes.
And it's a group of mostly professional musicians. And essentially, we all said we all have musical knowledge, we all have leadership experience, we all have an interest in contemporary music. So why don't we make decisions collectively, and we share ideas and we discuss things? Because now all of a sudden we have 14 people giving input, 14 experts giving input, as opposed to one person making all the choices. I mean, 14 heads are smarter than one.
Smarter than one.
You know? And there's an orchestra called Orpheus that kind of pioneered this idea, but they've produced a couple of books and some outreach projects to the business world,
Right.
and they've looked into businesses that are modeled in a similar way. It's
Right.
not necessarily that one influenced the other, but it's a common development in the world of leadership, and it empowers people to make better choices because they're closer to the action, they're closer to the problem.
Which makes absolute sense. They're closer to it, and everyone has a different perspective, and collectively they can come up with a decision.
Sure.
So we're not alone. We're not the ultimate authority. Wow, Julian, that was fantastic, and I'm sure our students will appreciate this, and I will be very happy to share the input from
Sure.
where this interview goes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you.